So, as we were talking the last time about the duck and cover video, as I said before, this is a very common video that they would show to every kid in class, perhaps numerous times throughout the school year. They would do these bomb drills. They would have these large sirens that would go off to get everybody ready. And you would go to your fallout shelter. You would go underneath your desk. If you were at your house, you'd have a location by which you would go to as well. And all of this was generated by the government to make sure that people knew that you needed to be ready and that it was a real life possibility that Russia could attack America at any point in time. And so you wanted to make sure that you were completely ready. This fear was even more amplified when two individuals were executed for espionage. They were selling secrets to the Russians. Two individuals, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Ethel's on the left, Julius is on the right. A husband and wife. They had kind of had some dealings in the State Department, meaning they kind of knew what was going on in foreign policy. And they were selling secrets right around the time of the Manhattan Project. If you guys remember, that was the creation of the atomic bomb. But they were selling secrets to the Russians. Now, there is some theories behind what it was that they were trying to help them out with, but they were both convicted and they were both executed. They were both given the electric chair. Julius' electric chair experience, not that any of them are supposed to be pleasant, but was more pleasant than his wife's. They're supposed to give them 3 electrical shocks. Usually the first one would kill them, and that's what happened with Julius. However, Ethel's took 5. They had 3, and her heart was still beating, and they gave her 2 more. And definitely a lot more graphic than what her husband's were. But in the newspaper headlines, this scared everybody to death because what this did is this reaffirmed in everyone's mind what the Russians were already doing. And so people were terrified of them. And this made that whole fear, the duck and cover idea, a real life possibility that Americans would sell secrets to the Russians in order to assist them. And these two had a history of being very communistic in their belief systems, but nonetheless, this placated a lot of the fears of the Americans. Let's move on to letter C, foreign affairs, and talking about stuff that's going on globally that would also affect us. We have a new Secretary of State. His name is John Foster Dulles. And John Foster Dulles was the new Secretary of State, very aggressive in his policy. This is a picture of him, and the guy on the left is Eisenhower. John Foster Dulles is the guy on the right-hand side. And one of the things he wanted to do was push a policy called rollback, which was to liberate communist countries, to liberate them to a time before communism even existed. And so he called that rollback, to go prior to a time when Russia wasn't dominating everything. He also had alliances that he wanted to create. One of them was called SEATO, and the other one was called CENTO. SEATO stands for Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. One more time, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. And that dealt with, like, obviously Southeast Asia, which would deal with like where the Philippines are, and Japan, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, those areas. And he would sign treaties with a lot of those countries to make sure that they did not go to communism. And also he had CENTO. CENTO stands for Central Treaty Organization, which was dealing with the Middle East, Israel, those countries there. He felt by creating more alliances and more friends around the world, that would probably prohibit the creation of communist countries in those areas. Another philosophy that he had was something called massive retaliation. Now, he was sick and tired of the Russians doing small little things such as spying on us, and so he came up with a philosophy saying that if you massively retaliated, then that would prove to someone that you don't want to mess with you. For example, they kill one of our guys, we kill 100 of their guys. They destroy one of our buildings, we destroy 50 of their buildings. And the massive retaliation idea kind of wanted to put more fear on them because they knew that if they did something to us, we would retaliate in a massive way. And again, the idea here is that you scare the enemy. You make them fearful that if they did attack you, that is not going to work, and that you will retaliate as best you possibly can and as quick and swiftly as you can. And another term that he threw around was the term brinkmanship. meaning willingness to go to the brink of war, like to the edge of war, like getting ready to go to the edge of war. And the brink just means edge, right, really close. And he really told Eisenhower that he felt that brinkmanship would be the best way to, again, make the enemy fear you. If they don't think you're going to go to war, if they don't think that you're willing to go to war with them, then they'll keep doing what they want to do. But if you're willing to get troops lined up on their borders, ready to fight them, then perhaps they would back down. And so this is John Foster Dulles, and again, a lot more aggressive policy, mainly because he saw Russia growing, and he saw communist growing, and he didn't want communism growing, and he did not want it to continue on. Next, let's talk about a term called worlds. If you notice on the map, you'll hear some people talk about a first world country. Perhaps more often than not, you'll hear somebody say a third world country. Now, let's talk about this. A first world country is one that is developed. That would be, and again, this map that I'm showing you is from the 1950s, not current. But this would be like America, Canada, England, most of Western Europe, like Germany, France, Italy. You'll notice you got some other countries like Turkey. Those are all developed countries. You also had a second world country was developing, which was most of what Russia had behind the Iron Curtain. They were developing their own system. They were developing their own economy. And then you also have what we call a third world country, which is an underdeveloped country. Now, as far as an underdeveloped country, we're talking about one that is poor generally, one that usually has a lack of education. The people are illiterate. They also have a lack of technology, meaning they do not have like satellites up in the air. They do not have like computerized systems. They would not have TV. They would not have maybe telephones. Again, we're thinking back to the 1950s. But they would have a lack of technology. They wouldn't have those things. And they would also have a lack of trade and resources. We're not saying they don't have any trade, because almost every country has something that they might trade with other people. But if you think about the vast amount of resources that America can trade with other countries versus maybe perhaps what an African nation could trade with other countries, or a Middle Eastern nation, or a Southeast Asian nation, and so a lack of trade. And so when you think about these, again, if you look at this map, just follow my cursor, again, the green would be the first world. These are 1950s developed countries. You know, you've got Japan over here, and again, notice how you got China and Russia developing. Australia owned by the British still, and so they're going to be a developed country. But notice all the red around here. They would even consider Mexico and also South America as considered a third world country. Now, why is this a big deal? This is a big deal because it kind of depends on what communism is going to target. Communism is going to target these underdeveloped countries and promise them the world to hopefully get them to become a developing and then eventually a developed country. So these underdeveloped countries, these third world countries, are going to be way more susceptible to a Russian invasion and Russian leadership. The Middle East. In 1948, Israel officially becomes a country. You guys have probably seen this flag, the Star of David. And in 1948, they officially become a country, and America recognizes them right away. And America says that we accept their leadership, how they came to power. And ever since then, America has been a friend to Israel. If you know your Bible pretty well, that's a pretty good thing. You want to be a friend to God's people. Its blessings will come from that. But in 1948, they officially became a country, and they kind of had their own territory. And it was supposed to be a homeland for Jews. However, if you know in that area, you've always had a conflict between Arabs and Jews, always fighting against each other. And part of this goes back to this map. You'll see a term here, Palestinian and Jewish land. Now, notice in this white area, there's like hardly any Jewish land here. But by 1947, the Jews had started to fight these Arabs or these Palestinians and push them back to these different areas. Why? Because they're looking at these Holy Land sites, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, the Gaza Strip, and by 1949, 1967, these two countries are fighting against each other, and then eventually Israel pretty much owns all of this, and little pockets of Palestinians own these areas. See, the Arab countries had invaded Israel to try to get their land back, specifically these Holy Land sites where Christ was born or where some people would believe that Muhammad came from and that type of stuff. And these Arab countries invaded Israel, and frequent wars and conflicts still exist between the two nations as they fight over these holy lands that they are trying to occupy themselves. Now, in world history, you guys will probably talk a little bit more about this, but why do I make you guys know this, or why do I suggest that you know this? It's mainly because we become a friend of Israel and still have today. And Israel occupies this area, and in 1948, we became a friend to the new country, Israel. And lastly, let's talk about Egypt here. Egypt had gained independence from Britain. The British had actually owned a large part of Egypt for a long time, and part of the reason why they owned this was because there was a lot of oil there. If you guys have ever driven by a BP station, you guys know, I think we might have even talked about this earlier this year, that BP stands for British Petroleum. You can tell your parents that you learned something via online learning this way, but BP stands for British Petroleum, and the British had actually owned part of Egypt because of that. There's a new leader of Egypt. His name is Gamal Abdel Nasser. And Nasser decides to nationalize the canal. Now, the Suez Canal is the area that allows people to come in and out of the Middle Eastern area. And it's kind of acts as like the Panama Canal almost in that area. And Egypt had denied Israel passage through. Why? Mainly because they were Jews and they didn't like Jews, and the Egyptians were Arabs and they did not like them. However, America did not like the fact that they did not allow Israel passage through, as they were supposed to be allowing everyone to pass through for trade. This begins what they call the Suez War, which was between Israel and Egypt. Now, as you look at this, you see the Suez Crisis. You actually have military boats there. But the U.S. had actually suppressed the crisis, and conflicts with Israel and Egypt had still continued. If you notice, the Evening Standard says, Nasser, the canal stays blocked. As long as a single foreign soldier is on our soil, we will not be taken by surprise again. Now, again, question becomes, Mr. Anderson, why the heck are you making us know this, or why the heck are you even introducing this when this could be a world history thing? The reason why I'm showing you this is because, again, the U.S. suppressed the crisis. The United States did not want wars all over the place. So we decided that we were going to go through, and again, because we're a friend of Israel, we decided that we were going to settle this conflict as much as we possibly could to make sure that there was not any continuing war between Israel and between Egypt, because we knew that that could potentially pin communists versus our own people. So that's the reason why I have you guys know part of this. Okay? Again, in world history, you guys should be covering more of this stuff, but at least this is introduced and you've at least heard of these terms. We will stop here and talk about Russia on our next lecture.